What's the most thing you've ever walked in on? Story 1. Went bar hopping with some friends a while ago, and one of the girls in the group had a habit of running off when she got drunk and getting into trouble. As soon as we realized she was gone, everyone split up to look for her. I went to check the restrooms. The bar that we were in had one restroom for both men and women, but multiple stalls. I found a stall with the door slightly open and heard strange noises from inside, so I figured she must be sick in there, and I barged in. It was not her. It was actually 3 men in a disturbing Sewell act. I backed out slowly, went outside, had a cigarette, and called it a night. Story 2. 2 things. First was around 2000 when I went for a job interview, and apparently no one told the guy who was supposed to interview me that I was coming. Some of the guys from the company pointed me to his trailer, and being 19 and naive, I just tapped on the door twice and walked in. This big man was sitting with his legs up watching adult films so loudly I could tell exactly what was going on. Thankfully, I was at the wrong angle to see anything graphic. Needless to say, I apologized, walked straight out of there, and decided that was not the job for me. The second time I got hired as a deckhand for a tugboat about 6 months later. When I walked on board, the first thing I saw was the galley. I noticed some pots with white powder on the side and instantly recognized the smell. I had tried drugs before and knew what I was seeing. The captain and mate were cooking illegal substances on the boat. I called the company and told them I appreciated the offer, but would not be working for them. I was not about to go hundreds of miles offshore with people like that in charge. No thanks. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I went to my grandparents' house because I needed some things I was sure my grandpa had in his garage. I was greeted by my grandma, who told me he was working there. I went to the garage, opened the door, and said, "Hey, Grandpa, do you remember that Saint?" But stopped dead. My grandpa was enthusiastically watching old adult films from the 1980s on a small television. I froze, turned around, and walked out. I am sure he saw me, and I saw him, and we both knew it. I went home, found my brother, looked him in the eyes, and said, "I just saw Grandpa watching something he definitely should not." After a few seconds of silence, we both burst out laughing for about 5 minutes until we had tears in our eyes. Grandpa was 90 at the time. If at that age you still have the willpower to entertain yourself like that, good for you. We never spoke about it again, and neither did he, but the next family reunion was definitely awkward. Story 4. It has been a while since I shared this. A walking-in story from a party I attended when we were about 17 or 18. A couple of hours in, everyone had arrived except one of the birthday girl's best friends. She eventually called and said she was out at a club and asked if she could bring a guy she met, whose name was apparently Sketch. Half an hour later, they showed up pretty drunk. After about 15 minutes, we realized they had vanished upstairs. The birthday girl did not want them fooling around in her bedroom, but no one wanted to walk in on them either. So we sent the drunkest guy to tell them to come back down. He went upstairs, and about a minute later, he came back looking pale and shocked. We asked what happened, and he said, "I went up, opened the door, and he was doing something intimate with her. Then he looked over at me, and I swear he was a vampire. There was blood all over his mouth, so I left." It turned out they had started fooling around, and it happened to be her time of the month. But Sketch decided to continue anyway. Unfortunately, we had sent the one person who, in his drunken haze, was absolutely not prepared to handle that. He looked completely traumatized for the rest of the night. Story 5. My pregnant wife once had a diabetic seizure in our bed after I got home from work, and I can honestly say I never knew fear before that night. It was a typical day, and I had gone to work early in the morning. At the time, I was working for a call center we jokingly called Heller X. My wife was about 7 months pregnant with our daughter Zelda, and yes, we are huge nerds who even made sure her initials spelled Zod. Because of the pregnancy, her blood sugar would swing between highs and lows, so I always made sure she had her medical supplies and snacks ready. After a long day of listening to complaints and processing hundreds of emails, I finally clocked out and headed to our small apartment near downtown Wilkes Barre. As I walked toward our door, I heard my wife screaming incoherently in pain. For a brief moment, I froze, thinking she had gone into labor. I immediately unlocked the door and ran inside. To my horror, my wife was lying in bed. flailing her arms and legs violently while foaming at the mouth. She had fallen asleep, and during that time, her blood sugar had dropped into the low 20s. There are two types of diabetic seizures, the mild shaking kind and the violent kind. This was the first time I had witnessed one of the violent ones, and knowing it could also harm our baby only amplified my panic. I forced myself to stay calm and ran for the glucagon shot. Within seconds, I injected her in the thigh and massaged the area to help it absorb quickly. After another 2 minutes of uncontrollable shaking, she finally came back. Both she and the baby were fine, and now our little girl is 4 and healthy as can be. Needless to say, that was the scariest moment of my life, and I have been through some terrifying situations, from car wrecks to skydiving, but nothing has ever come close to that fear. Story 6, I was working as a flight paramedic at the time. Our helicopter was down for maintenance, so I joined a ground unit around 3 in the morning to respond to an abdominal pain emergency. When we arrived, we found a man in his late 50s sitting on the bathroom floor in his underwear, which were no longer white. There was both fresh and dried blood all over him, the floor, and the bathtub. It looked like a crime scene. At first, we thought he had been shot. His skin was pale, but he was fully awake and alert, no longer complaining of pain. He said the pain had been severe, but came and went since midnight, and then he began vomiting blood. As he was talking to us, he suddenly stopped, got a blank look in his eyes, opened his mouth, and massive clots of blood started pouring out, no gagging or heaving, just a steady stream. It was one of the most disturbing things I had ever witnessed. About 20 seconds later, he snapped out of it and continued talking as if nothing had happened. We quickly transported him to the emergency room. I explained everything to the emergency physician, and we went into the patient's room together. As the doctor examined him, the same thing happened again, the blank stare, then the horrifying rush of blood and clots pouring from his mouth. The doctor turned to me and said, "I have never seen anything like that before, and I have seen a lot. Even after more than 15 years, I still get chills thinking about it." Story 7, I used to work at a grocery store when I was 16 to 18 years old and was a bagger for most of that time. We had a few employees with special needs, and they were all wonderful, but one of them often got himself into trouble. We can call him Adam. Adam had developed a habit of spending long hours in the restroom during his shifts, sometimes up to 2 hours at a time. Normally, our managers would send his job coach to bring him back, but on this particular day, the coach was busy, so I was asked to go find him. What I walked in on was beyond shocking. Not only had Adam been hanging out in there for hours, but he had also found a way to occupy himself. He was completely naked, lying on the floor, with his clothes neatly folded beside him, and clearly engaging in inappropriate behavior. The worst part was that he had taken a few pictures of employees who were set to graduate high school or college and had them with him. Story 8. This happened about 15 or maybe even more years ago. I was at a very mild house party with only about 6 people there. It was supposed to be a relaxed night with a few friends, just drinking and talking. One guy, however, got extremely drunk very quickly. He started being rude and confrontational, so we told him to go into another room and cool off. When we checked on him 30 minutes later, he was asleep, so we figured he was done for the night and left him there. The house belonged to a friend whose much younger sister was out with her parents. A few hours later, a few of us decided to walk into town for some late-night food. It took us about an hour to go and come back, and by the time we returned, everyone else was in bed, the lights were off, and the house was quiet. We walked quietly into the living room and turned on the light only to find the once passed-out drunk guy now lying face down on the floor, with his pants around his ankles and a toy doll stuck in a very disturbing place. We turned the light off immediately and backed out of the room without saying a word. This was back when cell phone cameras were rare and expensive, so taking a photo was not really possible, but if it happened now, someone would have documented it for sure. The next morning, the guy was gone, but the soiled toy was still there. The host cleaned it up, and none of us ever spoke about it again. Story 9. I used to live in a terrible neighborhood, truly terrible. One day when I was 7 years old, I got bored of playing safely inside my gated community with my friends, so I decided to sneak out. There was a big tree that grew over the gate, so I tied an old blanket like a rope and climbed out. There was a small store just 1 block away where I could buy candy, so that was my plan. Unfortunately, I climbed out right as the local militia was executing someone. I heard a scream and ran toward the noise, only to see 5 men too holding a man against a wall, one cutting his stomach open and another overseeing everything. I arrived just in time to see his intestines fall to the ground. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The man in charge noticed me, stopped everything, and came over. To my surprise, he spoke gently, asked my name, and wanted to know where I lived. He picked me up, carried me back to the entrance of my community, and handed me to the security guard. He never threatened me. In fact, he was oddly kind. But then again, he had just been in the middle of gutting a man, so I guess my sense of safety was more shock than logic. Story 10. I used to have roommates. One was an extremely large and very opinionated woman who worked at a bar, and the other was a super chill and genuinely kind guy. One day I came home from work, opened the door, and barely 10 feet in front of me, I saw my male roommate, who was 6 feet tall and very thin, with his much larger boyfriend. They were in the middle of an extremely intense and explicit act involving restraints and gear I had definitely not expected to see. I quietly backed out of the room, completely stunned. Another time I came home and found that my female roommate was throwing a party. I decided to avoid the chaos and went to my room to play some video games, only to find 2 guys in my bed doing things they absolutely should not have been doing there. She used to complain if I left a plate in the sink, yet she had no problem letting people use my room like that. She was truly a terrible and hypocritical person in every possible way. Story 11. I had a friend who lived in an apartment during college with 2 other people, a guy and a girl. The girl wasn't paying her share of the rent and had a pet rabbit she neglected. My friend mostly stayed in his room or away from the apartment because the tension between the 2 of them made it unbearable. One day things escalated and the guy jokingly told my friend that he had threatened to kill the girl's rabbit if she didn't pay up. My friend and I were out at the time, but when we came back to the apartment, we discovered that he had actually done it. He had beaten the rabbit to death with a bottle, skinned it, and hung it upside down in the shower to drain the blood. He was even wearing the rabbit's fur on his head, with a sickening grin on his face. After draining it, he cooked it, ate it, and left the bones out on the table for the girl to find when she got home. Karma caught up with him not long after. He hit and killed a pedestrian with his car, fled the scene, was caught on camera, and ended up in prison. Story 12. This happened when I was in secondary school around year 9. I was hanging out with a mutual friend, and we decided to stop by another friend's house to see if he wanted to hang out and smoke a joint. His mom let me in and said he was upstairs, so I went up alone to find him. He wasn't in his room, so I opened the door to his brother's room instead and froze. His brother was lying on his back with his legs up, and my friend was doing something that made me immediately understand I had just walked in on something shocking. He turned around and saw me, while his brother jumped up and ran past me to the bathroom. I left the house in total disbelief. Outside, I told my friend what I saw, and we just walked away in silence. Later, the guy spread the story around school and somehow tried to blame me for it. Maybe he should have thought twice before doing that with his own brother. We never spoke again after that. Story 13. I am deaf and hard of hearing, which is important to this story. About 5 or 6 years ago, my mom was in the hospital after surgery for cancer. She had been there for weeks, sharing a room with another woman who was very loud and demanding. One day, I was sitting there playing a game on my phone while her son and daughter stood near her bed. I noticed they were shouting and crying, but I assumed they were arguing. After about 15 minutes, my mom asked me to help her get out of the room. I hesitated because she was very weak, but I did as she asked. Once we were in the hallway, she told me quietly that the other woman had just died, and it was better for us to step outside so her family could say their goodbyes. I was in complete shock. Someone had died just a few feet away from me, and I hadn't even noticed. No nurses or doctors came in, and I had been sitting there playing on my phone. My mom calmly explained that the doctors had already told the family earlier that morning that she would likely pass away that day or the next. She hadn't told me because she didn't want to make me anxious, and since there was a shortage of rooms, we had to stay there. I started crying right there in the hallway, overwhelmed by everything: her illness, that woman's death, the quiet acceptance of it all. We walked a bit, even though my mom was far too sick to be moving. When we came back 2 hours later, the bed was clean, the woman and her family were gone, and a new patient was being moved in. A few months later, my mom passed away too, but at least when she did, it was peaceful, and we were alone. I still think about that day often. It feels surreal and deeply sad. Story 14. I once walked in on a guy I knew who was detoxing from Xanax, and it turned into the most bizarre night of my life. In no particular order, he had a seizure on the floor, denied that it ever happened, ran out of the hospital we took him to, punched a nurse, and even headbutted his own mother. At one point, he was about to tell me and my friend Jake some deep dark secret, but then stopped, mimed locking his lips, and pretended to throw away the key. He brushed his teeth around 20 times, and at one moment took a sip from a water bottle we gave him, only to spit it out and accuse us of trying to poison him. He also accused my friend of being a Cylon from Battlestar Galactica. I had never seen the show, but the accusation alone was wild. Later, his mother asked us to go back to his condo and let the dog out. The door was locked, so we had to break a window, and I ended up cutting my hand on the glass. The night ended with me exhausted, bleeding, and questioning reality. There were plenty of other chaotic moments, but those were the highlights. Do not do drugs, kids. Story 15. This happened years ago when I was working late at my information technology job in San Francisco. As I entered the city center BART station, someone ran up to the ticket agent, yelling that his friend was hurt and needed medical help. The agent and I hurried over to the stairway that leads down to the train level. When I looked down, I saw a man sprawled out on the stone floor with a pool of blood spreading around his head. I rushed down the stairs and started giving first aid to the best of my ability, while the agent called the police and emergency medical services. There was a doctor up on the upper level, shouting helpful instructions, but refusing to come down to help. The wall along the stairs was about 5 feet tall, and it turned out the man had been walking on top of it while intoxicated and fell off, fracturing his skull. He was bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth. I kept him still and conscious until help arrived. A freelance camera crew showed up long before the emergency responders, which felt disturbing at the time. Months later, I was contacted by a lawyer from BART for a deposition. That was when I learned the truth. One of the man's so-called friends had actually pushed him off the wall, and now the victim was suing BART for his fall. Story 16. I was working as a driver for a meal delivery program in a very rural area on a day when the snow was coming down heavily. I was running about an hour late, had finished dropping off meals and started on medical appointment pickups. When I arrived at my first client's house, an elderly man, I noticed a strange pile of snow next to my vehicle. Something about it did not look right, so I brushed some snow away and saw a foot. I panicked and began clearing snow quickly, thinking the man had fallen and needed help. As I dug more, I saw blood seeping through the snow. When I cleared his head, what was left of it, I realized what had happened. I found a gun near his hand. He had taken his own life in his driveway, apparently not wanting to make a mess inside his home for his children to find. He had even scheduled an appointment he didn't have so that someone would come and find him. Because of the storm, everything was delayed, which made the scene worse and more traumatic. I do not remember much else from that day except those moments and the fact that someone had to drive me home. The man was a regular client and a veteran. I remember the ship name embroidered on his hat every time I saw him. Story 17. When I was in 3rd grade, I was playing in the front yard with friends when several emergency vehicles sped past our street and turned off their sirens just as they passed. We got curious and decided to follow to see what was going on. It turned out that an older brother of one of my classmates, who was 15 years old, had taken his girlfriend for a ride on his new dirt bike. He tried to speed across the main road and cut through a church parking lot that connected to some local trails. The preacher, tired of kids riding through, had put up a steel cable across the entrance, but without any markers on it. When we arrived, the scene was horrific. The boy's body was lying in a large pool of blood, and his head was about 20 feet away, still inside his helmet. His girlfriend was screaming, tearing her shirt into pieces and pressing them against his neck as if she could save him. The police eventually pulled her away. Firefighters hosed the blood into the grass, and emergency medical workers loaded the body onto a gurney. A police officer found a cardboard box, placed the helmet, with his head still in it, on the gurney as well. That was over 45 years ago, and I still remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. Story 18. I do not know if this exactly counts as me walking in, but more like driving next to. Last year on Super Bowl Sunday, I was driving back to my university around 10:30 at night during a heavy snowstorm in Ohio. While driving on State Route 117, I was behind a life flight ambulance. The roads were slick with black ice and visibility was terrible. We were going about 45 to 55 miles per hour when the ambulance hit a patch of ice, started swerving, and then rolled off the road into a field, sliding about 30 or 40 yards. I stopped my car after sliding myself and ran out into the blizzard to help. At the front of the ambulance, I found the driver and passenger. Both were shaken but okay. I tried climbing up the side of the overturned vehicle to help, but they managed to crawl out through the passenger door, which was now facing upward. The driver yelled, "We need to help the guys in the back." As he opened the side door, now the roof, I heard a horrifying scream. My stomach twisted as I imagined the chaos inside. By this time, other drivers had stopped to help. We went to the back, where a woman and another man held the door open while I climbed in. Inside, one emergency medical technician wasn't strapped in and had been thrown across the interior. His head was jammed inside a cabinet, and his large body was twisted at an angle. The driver and I grabbed him by his belt. He weighed at least 300 pounds and lifted him into a more stable position. Another EMT in the back was struggling to unbuckle himself, his face bloody and swollen, likely from hitting something during the crash. The female EMT started grabbing supplies that were scattered everywhere. When we finally got the heavy man onto a stable surface, he began screaming, blood pouring from his mouth, forehead, and the back of his head. His front teeth were either missing or broken, leaving only red, empty sockets. He tried to fight us off while we held him down. The female EMT cut open his right pant leg, drilled near his knee, and administered ketamine and fluids to calm him. Meanwhile, a woman outside was on the phone with emergency services, trying to explain where we were. She seemed disoriented, either from shock or because she was unfamiliar with the area. I told her we were on State Route 117, just north of Huntsville and past a local winery. Eventually, the fire department, sheriff's deputies, and another ambulance arrived and took over. After giving my statement, I got back on the road and watched the Eagles beat the Patriots that night. As strange as it sounds, the adrenaline rush was incredible. I was a senior majoring in criminal justice, and that experience confirmed my desire to work in a field dedicated to helping others. Weeks later, I learned that the injured EMT had been airlifted due to internal brain bleeding, but survived. Knowing I had a small part in saving his life felt amazing. Story 19. A close friend of mine took his own life in February. I was his local next of kin since his parents were elderly and lived far away, so I worked with the police and real estate agents to handle everything, including visiting his home to look for important documents like his will. I expected his house to be neat and spotless, as he was always meticulous about cleanliness. What I walked into was nothing like that. The entire place was destroyed. House plants overturned, soil scattered, vomit in the bathroom. I remembered the voicemail he had left me before his death, where he mentioned cutting his gas lines. He had tried to blow up the house. The carpet and furniture were burned, the windows shattered, and everything inside was coated with a thin layer of ice from when firefighters hosed it down days earlier. The house felt frozen in time, like his last moments had been suspended there. Before leaving, I ran my hand over the wooden beam I knew he had hung himself from. There was a groove in the wood from where his weight had pulled down. I stood there in silence for a while, thinking about the pain he must have gone through. Future residents of that house may never notice that mark or know what happened there, but I will never forget it. Story 20. A 20-year-old man was stabbed in the chest in the middle of town, in a parking lot. We witnessed two men vandalizing his car, slashing the tires, jumping on the roof, and then running away. When we ran over to help the victim, he looked into our eyes for about 10 or 15 seconds, mumbled something, and then died right in front of us. I immediately called the police and emergency services. When the officers arrived, I described those two men as best as I could, and they began searching for them. Not long after, the victim's mother, father, and brother arrived. The father stood strong, the brother sat on the ground crying, and the friends nearby were panicking. The mother fainted repeatedly in the emergency vehicle. Every few minutes, she would wake up, scream, and collapse again. 2 officers kept me, the brother, and a friend to the side since we were the first and main witnesses. About an hour later, a higher-ranking officer drove us to the police station to give full statements. When we finally left after all the paperwork, several patrol cars pulled up, and I saw the 2 men who had done it being escorted inside. I said nothing. I was too shocked. 6 months later, we were called to testify in court. They admitted their guilt and were sentenced to prison. One was 21, and the other was only 14. I was 16 at the time. That night left a sight in my memory that I will never forget. Story 21. When I was 18, my mom picked up my girlfriend and me from the movies around midnight. We had gone to see the film Wall-E. After dropping my girlfriend off, my mom drove me to my best friend's house for a sleepover. His family was like my second family. They treated me as one of their own, always welcoming me, feeding me, and calling me son. I walked in, locked the door, and jogged upstairs to his room. When I opened the door, I froze. He was sitting there with a rifle at his feet, gasping for air, and a gunshot wound on the right side of his head. He had tried to end his life. He was taken to the hospital but died the next morning. It became one of the defining moments of my life. I still think about him often. Though the pain has faded with time, it has been 10 years now. Since then, I've made a point to be kinder every day, to talk to people, to offer a smile or a genuine conversation, because you never know who is struggling in silence. I am not sure if I believe in an afterlife anymore. His death made me question everything, but I still hope he found peace. And to anyone reading this who might be fighting their own battles, please do not face it alone. Reach out. Someone will listen. Story 22. I used to work as a taxi driver in Orlando. One night I got a call to pick someone up in a rough, working-class neighborhood. As soon as I pulled up, a woman came sprinting out of the house and jumped into my cab, screaming, "Drive, drive, drive!" Her face was swollen and bruised. Someone had clearly been beating her badly. Then a man burst out of the house behind her. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, but he jumped into his own car and started chasing us. He was right on my tail, trying to ram my cab off the road. I knew this was serious. Normal people don't act like that. There was a state trooper station a few miles away, so I aimed straight for it. The snowballing panic in that car was unreal. The woman was crying, the man behind us was honking and swerving, and I was running red lights just to stay ahead. Somehow we made it to the trooper barracks. As soon as he saw where we were, the man stopped his pursuit and sped off, unwilling to face 20 armed officers waiting inside. The woman was safe, and I finally exhaled. That was the night I realized taxi driving could feel like a scene straight out of an action movie. Story 23. I used to work as a manager at a $40 a night motel that was notorious for attracting drug users and sketchy guests. One of the worst experiences I ever had was when we had to evict a family of 4. There was an elderly couple, both around 70, and their 2 sons, each about 40. The sons kept complaining that their health was deteriorating and that they were suffering from constant seizures. Eventually, we had no choice but to kick them out. When I entered their room afterward, the smell hit me like a punch to the throat, a humid wave of rot, sweat, urine, feces, and meth. The bathroom was buried in trash. The toilet had been clogged for who knows how long, and instead of fixing it, they had been defecating on top of the pile. The floor was littered with bottles filled with urine, and the carpets were soaked with it as well. Trash was piled so high that in some spots it nearly reached our knees. They had once kept a dog, but it had gone missing, and we never found it beneath all that filth. While cleaning the room, 2 of my employees and I were accidentally pricked by discarded needles, and all of us threw up multiple times from the stench and horror of it. Story 24. This is not the most disturbing thing I have ever walked in on, but it is one I will never forget. Before our first daughter was born, my wife and I asked one of her coworkers to stop by our condo while we were at the hospital to check on our cats, just to make sure they had food and water. It was supposed to be simple. My wife had gone into full nesting mode before the birth. She had washed and organized all the baby clothes, stacked duplicate gifts neatly in bags to be returned, and cleaned the entire home so that when we brought our baby girl home, everything would be perfect. That night, we sent my mother-in-law back to the condo to rest, but she soon called, confused about what was going on. Worried, I left the hospital and drove home. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. The place was a mess. Sheets had been stripped off both the bed and the crib and stuffed into the washer and dryer, but they had been left wet long enough to start mildewing. The comforter was thrown carelessly on the living room couch. The duplicate clothes we had planned to return had all their tags removed and were scattered around, some partially washed. Takeout containers were left half-eaten on the counters, packaging and tags piled in a corner. And worst of all, the cats hadn't even been fed. I cleaned what I could, finished washing and drying the sheets, remade the crib, fed the cats, threw out the trash, and tried to restore some order before returning to the hospital. I told my wife that her mom had just needed some help settling in, sparing her the truth until later. Over the next few days, while my wife recovered and our newborn was still in the hospital, I worked with my mother-in-law to get the condo back into shape. But the damage was done. Many of the duplicate items were now unreturnable. Looking back, it seemed that her coworker and another friend had come over intending to help organize things, but instead they ignored what was already done and completely upended everything. We also suspected that the coworker might have used our bed for something inappropriate. Why else would someone wash freshly cleaned sheets in the comforter? When our second daughter was born, we didn't take any chances. I made sure the cats had plenty of food and water and locked every single door before we left. Story 25, I am a nurse, and over the past few years, I have seen some disturbing things. When I first started my career, I worked in a locked geriatric psychiatric unit. It was absolute chaos every single day, patients smearing feces on the walls, elderly people fist-fighting, and others engaging in inappropriate behavior in public areas. It was a constant circus of unpredictable and heartbreaking situations. But one incident stands out above all. I was doing my medication rounds one day and was about to see a little old woman who was completely bedridden and in the final stages of dementia. She barely spoke or moved and didn't belong in a unit filled with patients known for aggressive behavior. When I opened her door, I froze. A male patient, completely naked, was tearing off her diaper and assaulting her. He was essentially raping her. It was horrifying. He had no understanding of what he was doing, completely out of touch with reality, but the sight of it broke me. I had to intervene, report it, and start an investigation while also notifying both families. It was one of those moments that remind you how cruel dementia and mental illness can be, not because of malice, but because of the loss of humanity they can cause. Still, it's something that will always stay with me. Story 26. One morning, I was on a tram heading to work when I noticed a young woman sitting beside me, visibly shaking and crying while talking on the phone. Through her sobs, I heard her say, "I see him. He's on the tram. What do I do?" The tram was packed with commuters, but everyone nearby went silent, listening. The tram slowed to a stop between stations, and after a minute, she hung up, stood up, and pushed through the crowd toward a man. She asked him if he recognized her. He looked at her, said yes, and moved in for a hug, only for her to shout, "Don't touch me!" Her voice cracked through the silence. For the next 10 minutes, she stood there crying and confronting her rapist, her mother's ex-boyfriend, right there on the tram. The shock spread through everyone. A few of us stood between them to make sure she felt safe. The man stayed silent while passengers surrounded him in quiet rage. Someone asked if we should call the police, but she refused, saying she didn't want that. It was heartbreaking to see someone finally facing the person who stole her childhood, right in public, shaking and crying, but refusing to back down. Story 27. There had been rumors going around my school about people vandalizing the boys' bathrooms, missing the toilet bowls on purpose, or making disgusting messes. One day, I'm pretty sure I caught the culprits. It was the end of break time, and I went into the bathroom to rinse my retainer. From the stalls behind me, I heard two guys laughing and saying things like, "That all you got? Man, come on, your aim's pathetic." followed by the unmistakable sound of liquid hitting the floor. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to be sure, so I crouched down and looked under the stall dividers. Sure enough, 2 streams of urine were splattering into a puddle between the stalls. I stood up and said, "You two are disgusting." They came out looking ashamed and silent. I immediately reported them to the next teacher I saw. Honestly, I'm tired of idiots like that ruining things for everyone else and getting the bathrooms locked down because they can't behave. I heard later they got suspended, and honestly, they deserved it. Story 28. Back in 2008, when I was 20 years old, I was living in Vancouver for a year. One Saturday night around midnight, I was waiting at the ferry quay that leads downtown. There's a filthy public restroom near the dock, and I really needed to go, so I decided to use it. The moment I walked in, I heard faint muffled noises somewhere between crying and moaning. It sounded wrong. I turned around and saw a movement under one of the stall doors. 4 legs shifting around. I rushed through finishing up and looked closer. The door was slightly open, and I saw a teenage girl with her mouth covered by a man's hand while he was assaulting her. She looked drugged or dazed, and he looked to be in his late 20s. My heart dropped. He yelled at me to get out, but I ran out looking for help. There were no security guards or police nearby, just a few taxi drivers. I told them what was happening, and 2 of them followed me back. When we pulled the stall door open, the man was still attacking her. One of the drivers tackled him while the other helped the girl, who ripped a sock from her mouth and started screaming and kicking him. The sound was gut-wrenching. The police arrived soon after and arrested the man. We gave our statements, but since I wasn't a Canadian citizen, I couldn't testify in court. The girl had visible knife wounds on her abdomen and leg. A few years later, I received a letter from her family thanking me. They told me she had been 16 at the time, lost and trying to get home when the man lured her toward the ferry. He was later sentenced to 120 years in prison with no chance of bail for kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. I still think about that night sometimes. It was horrifying, but I'm grateful she survived. Story 29. In my sophomore year of high school, I was on the school newspaper team. I was the sports editor, but covered other stories when needed. One afternoon during the last period, we heard a loud explosion followed by screaming from down the hall. Without hesitation, our newspaper teacher told another student and me to grab our cameras and see what had happened. This was back in 1999, when student safety protocols weren't what they are today. We ran toward the sound, unsure of what we were about to find. The smell hit us first, something burnt that I didn't recognize at the time as human flesh. When we reached the scene, one of my friends and a few other students were on the floor, burned and still smoking. Inside the classroom, more students were screaming in pure terror. Their chemistry teacher had been conducting an experiment when something went catastrophically wrong, causing a chemical explosion that literally blew up in their faces. I stood there frozen, clutching the camera in shock. Then we ran back to the office to get help. I spent the rest of that class staring at the camera, thankful I hadn't taken a single photo. No one died, but one girl suffered severe burns across most of her body, and several others were injured. Years later, that same girl married a man who had survived a meth lab explosion, and together they now visit schools to talk about resilience and recovery. Still, every now and then, when I catch the faint smell of something burning, that day comes rushing back to me like it just happened. Story 30. When I was a kid, my dad decided to take my sister, my mom, and me to a museum. This was before navigation apps existed, so we relied on vague directions. We eventually arrived at a large official-looking building that seemed like it could be the place, even though there were no signs. We walked in, and though people noticed us, no one stopped or questioned us, so we assumed we weren't trespassing. The only problem was that it didn't look anything like a museum. It was more like a research facility. Curious, we went upstairs, and that's when things got strange. The second floor looked exactly like the kind of creepy science lab you'd see in a movie, jars filled with organs, preserved animals, and fetuses. And maybe it was just my child brain exaggerating, but I swear I saw something that looked like a human fetus floating in one of those jars. My dad immediately decided we were done there, and we all went out for ice cream instead. To this day, none of us ever figured out what that building actually was. Story 31. When I was 8 years old, I was watching cartoons on a Saturday morning around 9 o'clock when I noticed that my parents were still in their bedroom, which was unusual. Worried that something might be wrong, I went to check on them. The door was locked, but I had learned how to pick the locks around the house, so I carefully opened it. What I saw made my mind go blank. My mom was handcuffed to the bed and gagged, while my dad was standing over her, completely exposed. He turned around in shock when he saw me, yelling for me to get out. I slammed the door shut and ran back to the living room, shaking. The following days were painfully quiet and awkward as my parents tried to explain it away, though I already understood more than they realized. I remembered how my mom had once scolded me for looking at inappropriate things online, and now I knew they had been experimenting with the same kind of stuff she had called depraved. It was a moment that shattered how I saw both of them, and it's an image I've never been able to forget. Story 32. When I was a kid, my friend and I went into his backyard to kick around a soccer ball. He had a German shepherd that was always chained up outside with a long metal chain. The yard was shaped like an L, with the longer section stretching behind the house. When we came out and my friend called the dog over, there was no response, which was strange. We noticed the chain was pulled tight around the corner, out of sight. Curious and uneasy, we followed it, and when we got around the fence, our hearts stopped. The chain was stretched up and over the top of the fence, and the dog was hanging from it, lifeless. A thick, blood-colored foam was oozing from its mouth. My friend ran into the house, grabbed a butcher knife, and started hacking at the chain, desperate to get it loose. His cousin heard the noise and came outside. He was taller than us, so while he reached for the clasp, my friend and I, both only 11, had to lift the dog's heavy body to give the chain enough slack to detach. I'll never forget the sound it made when the tension released, a deep, guttural groan that came from its throat, even though it was clearly gone. We covered the body until animal control came to take it away. That image, the tongue hanging out, the blood-tinged foam, the rolled-back eyes, has been burned into my mind ever since. Story 33. A friend of mine used to be in an incredibly toxic relationship, not physically abusive, but emotionally brutal. His girlfriend never worked, spent all his money, and refused to clean or take care of their place while he worked 10-hour days. Eventually, the constant stress and mess broke him, and he ended things. About a week later, I went with him to help collect his things since he didn't have a car. When we opened the door to that apartment, the smell hit me like a punch to the face. It was the most disgusting place I've ever stepped into, like something out of one of those hoarding reality shows. They had 2 rabbits and 4 cats. The rabbits were fine, but the cat feces was everywhere. The litter boxes were overflowing, the floor was smeared with waste, and the stench was unbearable. She was a massive gaming collector, and while the stuff might have been cool if organized, it was piled in chaos across every surface shelves, the floor, even under the couch. Dust coated everything, swirling into the air with every movement. I honestly thought I was going to vomit. The smell and the filth still haunt me whenever I think about that day. Story 34. My ex-girlfriend once told me she had to stay late at work for a staff meeting at the upscale restaurant where she worked. I didn't think much of it. She even sent me Snapchat messages saying things like, "This meeting is so boring," and "Can't wait to leave." Hours went by. By around 2 in the morning, I was at a friend's place and had a few drinks when I decided to drive over to her job to wait for her. The restaurant had huge glass windows that looked straight into the dining area, so you could see everything inside from the street. When I pulled up, I saw her sitting at the bar with her boss. No one else was there. I waited a few minutes, curious. Then he came out from behind the bar, sat beside her, showed her something on his phone, and before I could even process it, they started kissing. Within seconds, she was on her knees in front of him, and I just froze, watching everything happen through the glass. My stomach dropped. Rage and disbelief took over, and I turned my car back on and drove straight toward the building, unable to control myself. I didn't crash into it, but that moment broke something in me. The betrayal, the humiliation, it all hit hard. I spiraled afterward, fell into depression, gained 40 pounds, and lost all trust in relationships. I've never fully recovered from that night. Story 35. I used to work on a contracted cleanup crew for law enforcement. We handled everything from robberies to violent crimes, and Suics were part of the job too. One call in particular has stuck with me ever since. A man had taken his own life on a railway line. He had positioned himself with his body just outside the tracks, his neck laid carefully across one of the rails so that, when the train came, it would decapitate him. When we arrived, the scene was silent except for the wind and the faint hum of distant trains. His head was in the middle of the tracks, pale and lifeless, and his body lay where he had positioned it, the neck flattened almost paper-thin from the pressure. Once the police had finished their work, it was our turn to remove the remains. When the body was lifted, the crushed part of the neck opened up like the seal of a Ziploc bag full of liquid. I wasn't the one handling the body. I was bent over in the bushes, vomiting uncontrollably. I'd always thought I had a strong stomach, but that day proved me wrong. It was the breaking point for me. I left that line of work soon after. These days I work as an electrical safety tester for a housing association, and I can honestly say I've never looked back. Story 36. My ex-girlfriend once overdosed on Hero right in front of me. She had just gotten out of rehab and was barely hanging on. The day she was released, one of her close friends overdosed and died. And just weeks before that, an ex-boyfriend of hers had taken his own life. She was grieving, broken, and trying desperately to stay clean. When I picked her up and brought her back to my apartment, she went straight to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard a loud thud. I assumed it was my upstairs neighbors. Another minute passed and I thought nothing of it until I remembered how she once told me the story of her sister's overdose. She said she had known it happened because of the loud crash when her sister collapsed in the bathroom. The memory hit me like lightning. I called out to her. No answer. I called again. Nothing. My chest tightened. I grabbed the spare bathroom key I kept in the hallway closet, unlocked the door, and found her on the floor, blue-faced, barely breathing, her pulse weak and fading. I called emergency services immediately. The operator guided me through CPR until the paramedics arrived. Somehow she survived. If I had waited even a few more minutes, she wouldn't have. I didn't feel like a hero, though. The next day she started using again, stole money from me weeks later, and disappeared into another cycle of addiction. But the image of her lying there lifeless, cold and barely hanging on, will never leave me. Addiction is brutal, and it destroys people from the inside out. I learned then that addicts don't need judgment. They need compassion, because sometimes love is the only thing left that might save them. Story 37. I am a first-time mom, and I am still learning how to process the kind of love and fear that come with being responsible for a tiny human. A few nights ago, I went to check on my daughter as she slept peacefully in her crib and froze. Sitting on her cheek was a spider so big it looked like it crawled straight out of Chernobyl. I could see the hair on its legs, thick enough to braid. I'm not even afraid of spiders, but in that moment I stood completely still for 3 long seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Then instinct kicked in. I ran across the room, scooped her up, and brushed the creature off her face. I have no idea where it disappeared to, but ever since, I've been paranoid. She hasn't slept in her crib since that night. She sleeps beside me now. What scared me most wasn't the spider itself. It was realizing how easily I froze, how slow I reacted, and the fear that next time something happens, I might not move fast enough. I've seen many awful things before, but that one moment, the mix of terror, love, and helplessness left a lasting mark. Story 38. When I was a kid, my family went to church one Sunday while visiting my grandma. It was my first time ever going. My uncle, a Vietnam veteran, lived with her then. He was quiet, withdrawn, and spent most of his time in the basement watching C-SPAN. He drank a lot and carried a heaviness you could feel even as a child. The one memory I have of him before that day was when he pushed me on a swing once. He smiled then. After church, my dad told me to go downstairs and get my uncle for dinner. I went down, opened the basement door, and froze. He was sitting on the couch, a shotgun between his legs, the barrel resting on his neck where his head should have been. The wall behind him was covered in blood and bone. It was the most violent thing I had ever seen. But the worst part wasn't that. It was walking back upstairs and seeing my dad's face when he looked at me. He saw my expression and knew immediately. His smile disappeared, replaced with a pain so deep I can still picture it perfectly, even more vividly than the horror downstairs. That moment, his heartbreak stayed with me far longer than the image of my uncle's death. Story 39. A few years ago, I worked at a gas station with restrooms located outside the building. The rule was that if someone took longer than 30 minutes, we had to check on them. One day, a man came in, grabbed the restroom key, and disappeared. About 45 minutes later, I realized he hadn't returned it, so I went to knock. I heard noises, heavy breathing, groaning, but no response to my questions. I thought he might be having a medical emergency, so I unlocked the door as policy required. The smell hit me first, a stench so vile it made me gag instantly. Then I saw what was happening. The man was sitting on the toilet, actually using it, and a woman, his girlfriend I assumed, was straddling him, her skirt draped over both of them. When I opened the door, she screamed, jumped up, and bolted past me, leaving him exposed and humiliated. He just sat there, pants around his ankles, eyes wide in panic, the room reeking beyond belief. Then, in the most surreal moment possible, he let out a small, squeaky fart. I lost it. The absurdity was too much. I stumbled outside, doubled over in laughter until I cried. It was disgusting, horrifying, and somehow hilarious all at once. Story 40. About 7 years ago, when I lived in Minneapolis, I was heading home from work in the afternoon. I had to take 2 buses and my transfer point was in a rough neighborhood. But since it was only 3 o'clock, I wasn't too concerned. I'd been waiting a few minutes when a white van came speeding around the corner. The side door flew open and a naked woman tumbled out onto the street. The van door slammed shut and it sped away through a red light. The woman, covered in bruises and blood, ran toward me screaming for help. I gave her my coat and called the police. Within a minute, the same van screeched back around the corner and stopped right in front of us. A man got out, lifted his shirt to reveal a gun tucked into his waistband, and yelled at us. My heart stopped. I thought I was about to die. Just then, 2 police cars appeared from up the street. The van sped off, one patrol car in pursuit, while the other stopped to help us. The officers took us to the station for statements, and when I finally got home hours later, I curled up under my blanket and cried. What haunts me most is the woman's face, the terror in her eyes as she ran toward me, desperate and broken. Story 41. When my fiancée was in labor, it had been nearly 20 hours of exhaustion and anxiety. I finally dozed off for a short rest while her mother stayed with her. I woke up to her screaming. I turned over and saw our newborn son lying on the delivery platform at the end of the bed, still attached by the umbilical cord, blue and not moving. My fiancée was alone, and her mother was gone. I panicked, ran into the hall screaming for help, but no one was there. I sprinted through the hospital until I found the neonatal intensive care unit, pounding on the door and begging for someone to come. A nurse followed me back to the room. By the time we returned, my son was crying, alive and safe. It turned out my fiancée had told the nurse earlier that she felt the baby coming, but the nurse brushed her off, saying he wouldn't come without assistance. Moments later, our son proved her wrong. He delivered himself. My fiancée's mother lifted the blanket to find his head already out. He arrived completely on his own, healthy and strong. It's terrifying to think how close that moment came to tragedy. But somehow, our son entered the world entirely on his own terms. Story 42. Back in 1994, when I was a sophomore in high school, a few friends and I decided to revisit our old elementary school one summer night. We were all former students, and we had taken a couple hits of acid earlier that evening. Around 11 o'clock, we climbed onto the roof of Dodge Elementary School to hang out, smoke, and laugh ourselves silly. There were lights on in the building and cars in the lot, which seemed weird, but we didn't think much of it. Later, when we climbed down, we wandered to the darker side of the building, and that's when we saw them. In the moonlight, a man and a woman were behind a tree, switching positions and going at it like animals. We froze 10 feet away, staring. They noticed us. For a second, everyone locked eyes. Then we all started laughing uncontrollably, tripping too hard to run properly. By the time we stopped laughing, they had vanished. It wasn't a hallucination. The acid wasn't like that. We later figured out that the cars and lights probably meant staff were there, and apparently, Some of the school's employees were using the place for weekend hookups. It's been decades, but that surreal night at Dodge Elementary still makes me laugh every time I think about it. Story 43, I used to work for a small startup that was trying to copy Groupon's business model back when Groupon first took off. Our office was inside a big corporate building, and since we didn't have employee parking, we had to park across the street in a public lot by a large outdoor mall. One morning I was running late for my early shift and had just gotten out of my car to put on my belt when I heard a deafening bang. It was so loud I thought a car had driven off the top of the parking structure. I ran toward the sound and found a woman lying on the ground, barely alive. She had jumped from the top level 4 or maybe 5 stories high. It was early and only one other person was there, an off-duty firefighter or paramedic who had been heading into the nearby 24-hour fitness. He immediately started doing what he could while I called 911 and waved down emergency responders as they arrived. But she couldn't be saved. I stood there helpless as she took her last breath. I remember seeing a single tear roll down her face before her body went completely still. That moment broke something inside me. I went into work, tried to explain why I was late, and before I could finish, I broke down. I quit that same morning and have never been back to that parking lot since. Story 44. This one isn't mine, but my old roommate told me about it, and it's haunted me ever since. He was a server at a nice local steakhouse and had picked up an extra shift for a coworker. That night he was serving 2 men in their late 30s or early 40s. They were calm, polite, and seemed to be having an ordinary conversation over dinner. They ordered expensive food, good wine, nothing seemed off. When my roommate brought their check and went to the back to grab food for another table, he suddenly heard 2 loud gunshots. The entire restaurant froze. When people rushed to see what happened, both men were slumped over the table, blood everywhere. The story came out later. One of the men was the older brother of the other man's girlfriend. Apparently, the boyfriend had gotten the brother's sister addicted to meth and was forcing her into prostitution. The brother found out and snapped. Right there in the middle of the restaurant, he shot the boyfriend in the head and then turned the gun on himself. My roommate said there was blood and brain matter splattered across the table and walls, and both men's bodies twitched for a while afterward. One of them even convulsed so violently that his knees kept hitting his chest over and over. He tried to act like he was fine afterward, but I could tell it messed him up deeply. That night stayed with him for years. Story 45. When I was a kid, I went with my mom to the vet to have one of our horses checked out. After 20 minutes of listening to them discuss hay, hooves, and other horse things, I got bored and wandered toward the livestock area. That's when I saw something I'll never forget. 2 men were standing behind a bull, one holding what looked like a pogo stick from hell, the other ready with a cup attached to a pole. I just froze. The guy with the pogo stick shoved it up the bull's backside and flipped a switch, and I swear I could feel my soul leave my body. I sat down on a bucket and just watched in stunned silence as they worked their way through a whole line of cattle, like it was an assembly line of bovine humiliation. No one even looked embarrassed. Not the men, not the bulls. It was business as usual. Later, I asked the vet what I'd witnessed, and he explained it was electroejaculation, basically stimulating the bull's prostate with electricity to collect semen samples. The guy with the cup was catching it for storage. Even after the explanation, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or gag. Apparently, that's just another day in large animal medicine, where sticking your arm up a horse's rear is basically the handshake of the trade. Story 46. For about 9 months, I managed a halfway house, the same one I had lived in the year before. You get used to seeing tough things in that job, but one Thanksgiving morning broke me in a way nothing else ever has. One of the residents, John, was supposed to be picked up by his parents to spend the holiday with them for the first time in a year. His roommate mentioned he'd been in the bathroom for a long time, and the shower had been running nonstop. His parents were already waiting in the living room, so I went to check. I knocked, no response. My gut dropped. I picked the lock and opened the door, and there he was, crumpled between the sink and the toilet, foam and blood spilling from his mouth and nose, his skin pale and lips turning blue. A needle and spoon lay on the counter. I'd seen overdoses before, but this time his mother and 10-year-old sister were right behind me. The second they saw him, The sound that came out of them didn't even sound human. His mom screamed his name, his sister just wailed.